And we're recording. So what we were kind of just talking about right before this was that I think we have a couple intuitions for what these deep conversations are all about. And there's a lot that's going on under the hood that I want to try to get at. And it's really hard to get there and navigate that whole landscape just off the cuff. But I think what I'm hoping is that what these first 10 to 20 podcasts are going to be doing is helping us sort of develop the vocabulary to get there quickly and then navigate that space down there once we're there. Because I think what I'm kind of finding is that I kind of have an intuition for what I want to say, what I want to talk about, but it's kind of clunky getting there, and it's kind of talking past each other a little bit. But what I've noticed is that after I've had the first podcast about that topic, it's like if I had a second podcast about the same topic, it's like, oh, we could get there really quickly and then talk about things at a deep and kind of high level, a little more fluidly. I don't know. It was kind of a ramble.
Yeah.
But I think with our conversation, because you were here before, right? You were on the second podcast we did about what the faith is. Yeah, it was the group cast. Kind of faith for scientists and engineers, and I think everyone was kind of coming in with their own idea of what that means to them. And I was trying to process that kind of in real time. But now that I've had that experience where I've kind of processed it, it's like, well, maybe I could kind of lay out a framework first at the start of the next the follow-up podcast to that, whatever, maybe episode 20, I don't know.
Yeah.
But lay that groundwork right off the bat kind of quickly and then build off that, and hopefully that would lead to a more clear and deeper conversation at the same time. I'm kind of talking at you right now.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're trying to maybe an analogy is like when you're building a mine shaft, you go down, right, and then you have different branches that come off, and so once you've dug those certain tunnels and branches, you can just easily take an elevator down and start off right where you left.
A lot more naturally just get there without as much effort and clunky clunkiness.
Yeah, and you were talking about the vocabulary, and I think having the right tools, vocabulary will help get you to that place.
Hopefully, because I'm really excited to talk about this topic, which was conceptualizing God, because I think I have some basic intuitions about where I want this to go, but I don't think we're going to maybe articulate it perfectly this first time around, but hopefully this kind of lays some vocabulistic groundwork to help us get there in podcast number, 22, but I even wrote a cheat sheet here.
There you go.
So I think the guiding question for what I want to talk about today is, to what extent is a spiritual crisis also a conceptual crisis? Maybe if I could rant for another minute here.
Sure.
It seems to me like there's 3 scenarios where this is especially relevant, where we have to have some kind of conceptual clarity about what God is, if that makes sense. On the one hand, it's ourselves, it's our own spirituality, where if we have this image of God as some kind of benevolent grandpa figure who pats us on the head and tells us to be good, that doesn't capture everything about it. Like, if you start going through the the ups and downs of life, and you start getting your ass kicked, it's like the whole grandpa image of God as a genie who we pray to him when we're good and he gives us what we want. Like, that's too naive, and when we have to start struggling through things, that whole image of God is just, we see that it's wrong. It doesn't hold up here. So maybe the first instance where we have to have a sort of conceptual maturity is with our own spiritual life. We have to have a mature conception of who God is in order to understand ourselves and our relation to him. Maybe the next example would be people who are close to us, our kids maybe. Who is God? We have to have some kind of understanding of that in order to pass it on. And maybe the third example would be other people, like non-Christians. And the example that comes to mind is people still strawman God as, he's some guy in the clouds. And it's just, I still hear that today, and it's like that. misunderstanding of who God is to us. It seems like there's a conceptual crisis here that's correlated at least with other spiritual crises in ourselves, in the church, and in non-Christians. And it's like there's some kind of connection between a spiritual clarity and a conceptual clarity, if that makes sense. There's some kind of basic intuition there that I have, and hopefully we can explore that a little bit. That was the entirety of my note card, so the rest of this is off the cuff.
Okay, great.
But I don't know if you have any reactions to that.
Well,
that was a lot.
As you're I have a lot of reactions to each part of what you were saying.
Sure.
And I want to make sure that we stay on topic and where you're at. But maybe we could just real quick. You could go over those again. Is the one is.
Let's say the first example is ourselves.
Okay, yeah. So you're trying to discern between a spiritual crisis and a conceptualization crisis. In how we view God.
Or maybe a more pointed question on that point is, has a philosophical or theological clarity ever provided a spiritual solution? Like, is there any examples that come to mind where, I have to reformulate the way I think about God, but that actually provides a a spiritual clarity for me?
Yeah.
Where reframing my conception of God is actually spiritually beneficial. And the thing that kind of comes to me, I kind of probably talked a little bit about it already, but kind of when I was in high school, for example, I had this notion of God as like, do good things and good things will happen to you. Or just stay on the straight and narrow and life is gonna just work out. And that wasn't working out for me. Like there were were times in high school like where I have to deal with rejection from schools that I was trying to get into, from jobs, from girls. Like I have to deal with all this, and the response has to be growth. Like if I want to get a job, I gotta focus on developing skills, and I want to get into a good school. I gotta focus on developing myself. I want to focus on my relationships with people. It's like I gotta kind of clean my own house. But that's not. So the idea that God is just do good things and good things will come to you, that's not quite right. Right? He'll let your ass get kicked. Just for the sake of maybe growth. I don't know. But there's a conceptual clarity about God. Like that's not who God is. Like God is not who I thought he was. Right? And
based on these experiences that I've had.
Right. Or maybe another example is if you feel like you're beaten down with sin, or if you're falling into the same habitual sin and you feel shame, like shame is not quite the right reaction. Right? The right reaction is get up. You have a life to live. There's no use getting caught in this habitual. Like get up. It's a more, I don't want to say positive, but like shame is kind of incompatible with how God looks at us.
To an extent, I would say. I'd say there's something to say about having a healthy sense of shame. That there is something broken in us, right? As human beings, and that is a part of us that when we have sinned we get in touch with, and I would say that a healthy amount of shame is just recognizing just that, right? That I'm broken, that I've done something wrong, but like you said, not allowing that to be the only conceptualization of yourself, right, or of sin or of God, in that you experience a lot of negative emotions that aren't very helpful, and in living the Christian life, they're not very helpful, right? Because, like you said, they beat you down, they get you to feel certain ways and to despair. And I think what you were saying before was interesting because I think your experiences in high school seem to reflect a development of your conceptualization. So your view was rather simplistic, right? God was just a grandfather who patted you on the head when you prayed to him and he would do good things for you. And then you realized, well, I know God is good, but all these bad things are happening to me even though I'm praying, right? And even though I'm doing, quote unquote, the right things. So something either, and I think you recognize this, either there's something wrong about the way I'm conceptualizing God, right? Or or who God really isn't who I thought he was, right? So either I'm getting it wrong, or there's actually something different going on here. And it sounds like you had to try to integrate those experiences into your conceptualization, right? So now that I've had these bad experiences, right, reality's kicking me in the ass. Well, now I got to figure this out.
Or even reframe the concept itself.
Mm-hmm.
Where God is not who I thought he was. You know, and I think you go through this with people sometimes, where it's like, oh, you're not quite who I thought you were. Where I have this conception of you in my head, and then all of a sudden we're in a brand new situation, and you act in a way that I didn't expect.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I have to reframe my conception of you.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And then even at times reminding yourself of your conceptualization, because I think at times we do forget that we can as humans hold two conflicting beliefs at the same time, which is where we get like an emotional disturbance, right? Is that, okay, I have this belief that God is good and that good things will happen to me if I pray to him. Bad things have happened, right? So I have these two conflicting ideas, and when they come together, when I experience them at the same time, well, which one do I believe more, right? Which one will eventually, or should I change my view, right? It's not just that God is a simple sort of gumball machine, right? And it's not just that bad things, just because bad things happen, or that nothing bad should happen to me. But we come up with more subtle ways of viewing the world and reminding ourselves of those things, right? So we have something bad happens to us, and I have to remember, oh gosh, something bad happened. So now I'm feeling this tension. But I have to remind myself, okay, so even though bad things happen, God is still good. And right, so I think it takes time. Maybe that's what I'm trying to get at, is it takes time to reconceptualize, and an intentionality. So it's not just that you sort of come up against it and resolve it, that tension between the two beliefs or the two experiences at one point, but that a proper integration requires that you keep coming back to it. Every time something bad happens, you have to remind yourself, okay, it's not because this is hopeless or God is bad. God is loving, but bad things still happen.
Yeah, so maybe, do you agree with the problem statement, which is, it sounds like you do, which is, our notion of God is kind of in a sort of flux.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when our expectations are defied.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Then we
That's
have
a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. So if what we expect doesn't come true,
mm-hmm.
doesn't come to reality, then we have to reform the whole framework which created these expectations,
mm-hmm.
and this whole conception of who God is. So one kind of pointed follow-up question is, if our idea of God is subject to change, or let's say is subject to further clarification or further updating,
mm-hmm.
Where's the confidence in what we're handing down to people, or is there something solid in there? So there's got to be some kind of solid foundation here, and maybe it's a stage,
mm-hmm.
and the dance that's going on top of the stage, the whole play that's going on top of this foundation, maybe that'll change, but the foundation itself would seem intact regardless of the situation. So maybe what's the core?
Conceptualization?
I guess, yeah.
Okay.
Or anything.
Yeah.
Like, let's maybe, before we get to conceptual, like, there's something solid that we've, bitten onto.
Yeah.
Some kind of solid bite of food here.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the thing that we're chewing on that's,
that's going to fill us or actually
so
us,
even
or...
like it seems like science, for example, like the analog in science is we don't have all the scientific answers to everything, but we still use the scientific method to move forward and navigate our new questions
mm-hmm.
about nature, let's say.
Yeah.
Right, so if we come up with dark energy, we have no idea what it is, but we're going to still take our scientific tools and apply it to this new phenomenon.
Right.
Right, so that seems like we want to hand down, maybe it's almost like when it comes to God, it's a similar thing where we don't want to hand down a rigorous definition of everything that's happening, but it's like we want to hand down the ability, we want to hand down a superpower. And the superpower is, look, there's this core which you can apply to your new situations. Does that make any sense at all?
It does.
Like,
no, and I think I kind of understand where you're coming from, and if our original question was something like, can or how do resolutions in our conception of God also resolve spiritual difficulties or spiritual conflicts, then just as you said, that proper conceptualization should be able to act as a stage, right, where we can dance upon and not have any worry of like falling off or splintering or like things coming into our foot, right? That it's a solid stage and we don't have to worry about, but that we can still have this sort of back and forth that happens in a dance. Then that conceptualization or foundation would need to be something steady, would need to be something that applies to all of us.
Maybe to put it in another way, belief in God seems more to me like a process rather than a philosophical statement. So I think traditionally what we've been handed down is this cookie cutter explanation of the definition of the philosophical attributes of God, where God is all powerful, all knowing, all good,
right?
And that's what we believe in. And here's 5 proofs for his existence from Thomas Aquinas, and great, sure, and maybe we accept those propositions, but it seems to me like what belief in God is to most people is this process, where we actually start with a certain posture towards God or a certain posture towards reality, and then that plays out in our lives.
Right.
And we seem to be, I don't want to say lacking, but let me just be provocative maybe. Let's say we're lacking an expression or expressions which capture that dynamic. Where we've sort of captured the static truths about God, the static truths of his attributes of being all knowing, all good, so on. And maybe maybe there's some static truths about the historicity of Jesus. But that doesn't capture the dynamic of being in a relationship with God and letting that play out in your life and in your community. And that seems to be the real crux of what we want to hand down to people. But it seems like we're lacking a vocabulary that captures that. Aside from saying what I just said.
And maybe it's not simply a vocabulary. What comes to mind is, like we were saying before, part of belief is action, and maybe it's not so much a vocabulary, but a sort of way, the ways in which we live our lives, day to day. One of the things that I remember from my studies in philosophy in undergrad was one of the professors we were studying the Greek philosophers, Aristotle, but then everyone before him, I think Parmenides and those guys, was that, and it gave me chills when I first heard it. It still does when I think about it. But we were talking about these concepts. Plato has the forms, right? And that if we truly understood what God's justice looked like, if we really understood what justice is, just for instance, right?
Justice being one of the forms.
One of the forms, but that was the context of the conversation. But the concepts of justice and what it actually would entail living that the full scope of justice out. We would really, I think, pause before we even considered applying it full scale. just because
we'd be so intimidated by the
because
task of being just.
Because of the exactly. You know, no one would stand up to that standard. No one. And so I think that it's important to consider that many people don't have, again, these sort of articulation or really consistent application of these beliefs or ideas across the board. And if that happened, I think we would see a very an extreme change in the way that people live their lives. I hope I'm making sense here, but
so if we could, let me see if I'm understanding. So, like, let's say the human experience involves justice and mercy, but the pursuit of goodness and the pursuit of meaning and the pursuit of right relationships.
Right.
And
those ideas, but not just those, right? So, you know, if we actually had a fully integrated understanding of our human limitations, right, I think people would act much differently. If we had a full understanding or full appreciation or full integration of the idea that we are supposed to love our enemies, I think we would see a completely radical change in people's behaviors. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. Is
there a difference in your mind between integration and articulation?
I think you need to be able to articulate in order to have. I think articulation comes in the process of integration. Maybe that's a good way of putting it.
Okay.
You know, so you know, if we really understood who God is and what God is, and that belief produced action, because that's what belief does, right? As we were saying before, you know, I work with people and I try to help them understand the relationship between belief and emotion and action, and that our beliefs, if we really take a look at what we're thinking in a specific moment to cause our emotions, that cause our actions, you know, so what, you know, and I ask people, like, what would you have to be telling yourself to make yourself feel so anxious, right? And then you know, spend the whole day on Netflix. And people will be saying, oh, well, I was probably thinking something like, you know, if I'm gonna fail this test, right? And that would mean, so you would fail this test, and then I would take them through what's called a downward arrow, and this is cognitive behavior therapy.
Like the worst thing that could happen.
So what you would do is you'd ask them, all right, so if you failed that test, what would that mean? Well, it would mean that, you know, like, I came to college for nothing, right? Like, it was, you know, that I'm going to fail the class. Okay, so what would that say about you if you failed the class? Well, I mean, again, it would probably mean that I spent all this money on college for nothing. Like, okay, so what would that mean about you if you spent all that money on college and, you know, you failed this test? It would probably mean that, you know, that I'm stupid, right? That I'm an idiot. Okay, well, what would that mean if you were an idiot? Well, it probably means, you know, there's a process, right? People don't necessarily have this sort of clean-cut downward, but you try to get at the core belief. And once you identify the core belief, I try to work with people to alter that belief through behavior experiments, through role plays, through thought records. And so it's this process of trying to, once you've identified the core belief, that, you know, is the basis for these assumptions, these rules, these attitudes that are then the basis for their thoughts, their automatic thoughts, right? I'm going to fail this test. I go all the way down, it means I'm stupid, or I'm worthless, or I'm a complete idiot.
And their anxiety is their way of acting out this idea, this fear that I'm an idiot.
Would match that, right?
Is they're acting it out without having it fully articulated?
Exactly. And that's what I was saying earlier, was that, you know, people have such a hard time articulating these ideas is because they develop them, and this is a theory, right? So this isn't, you know, necessarily hard science. It's a way of understanding this process. Sure. And I think it's important to consider, because this is how I'm thinking about now our conversation of our conceptualization of God. on a personal level, is that these beliefs are created as we're children, before we have the hardware, right, the prefrontal cortex to sort through them or to actually articulate them in words. So then what I do is that, okay, so, when you're thinking about this test and you're looking at this book, right, you start to feel anxious. You start to think, I don't understand this book, right? And then that goes all the way down to that core belief of, I'm a loser, I'm incompetent, right? But in this other situation, where you were in class and, you didn't understand the question, so you raised your hand and you asked a question, but you didn't feel anxious that you were, so what was going on there? So you compare these two situations, right? So in one situation, this belief is activated, right? That for some reason, whatever it is, you have these associations that leads back to this belief. But in this other situation, you had this other reaction, emotionally and behaviorally, where you felt, okay, like, I'm not necessarily a loser or incompetent, right? There's stuff that I can do to remedy the situation, so I'm going to ask a question. So, how do these two things work? So it seems that you have these two beliefs, that on the one hand, in one situation, you think you're incompetent, but on the other, you seem to think that you are competent but make mistakes sometimes. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the idea that I was getting at, is we can hold these two beliefs, and one belief might be active at one point, and another belief might be more active at another. And maybe that also gets back to what you were saying about this sort of process, this sort of fluidity to our conceptualization of God. That was a lot. So what do you think about that one, now that that's out?
I think I'm going to shut my door and see if that fixes the leaf blower.
Yeah.
There we go. It's getting nice and dark on the screen.
Yeah, we can move the lamp.
I wonder if that would work. Yeah. Might be. Oh no. You know what? Our audience can deal with it. So. So, when you say the downward arrow, what I think about is a sort of hierarchy of beliefs, mm-hmm. where there's something very basic at the bottom, mm-hmm. and there's more situational truths up top. Maybe in your case, the situational truth is, I'm reading a book and I don't get what's inside of it, and mm-hmm. so maybe I'm stupid. And if I'm stupid, like, that goes all the way down to my identity, mm-hmm. which is this much bigger, more general thing.
Right, and that would indicate to you that that's the right belief because it matches the amount of anxiety you're feeling. Does that make sense?
Gotcha. So
that's just
yeah. So the anxiety being, like, if I'm questioning my own stupidity, mm-hmm. or my own intelligence, that's going to cause a lot of anxiety because my whole identity is as an intelligent college student who's going to go make a career. Mm-hmm. That's all called into question. I think, let's say where that comes back to God and this whole idea of the so there's this. I want to try to bring it ultimately to the discussion about God, but
for sure,
there's got to be a dynamic expression where in physics we have dynamic expressions, which it's not the situation itself, but it's a framework which lets you talk about situations.
Okay.
So if I'm looking at, I don't know, I drop a pencil on the floor and it kind of bounces in a weird way, there's a way to talk about the impulse at each point of the pencil and how the material reacts, but there's this broad framework of forces. A force mm-hmm. is an accelerating mass, or if a mass is accelerating, there must be a force on it. Mm-hmm. And there's, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. This is the whole classical mechanics.
Right.
And at the bottom, there's a few general principles which capture the dynamics, which lets you talk about the forces that are acting on the situation. Mm-hmm. All the different forces at play, let's say, in this situation.
Right.
I think Sam Harris kind of does this with his book, The Moral Landscape, where his assertion is, and not to switch gears. I mean, this is kind of related, but like for him, he's talking about ethics, and ethics for him has to do with consciousness, where ethics just has to do with conscious states. Let's say it's just about the movement of, or the different conscious experiences. Like that's any ethical statement has to do with what animals or people are experiencing. And all ethical statements have to be in terms of the experience. Now, that doesn't tell you any particular ethical statement, but it gives you a framework of sort of vocabulary to talk about the forces in action here, if that makes sense. Where he's not making particular ethical claims, but it's sort of a framework within which we fit ethical statements. In the same way, in physics, we have dynamics, or let's say classical mechanics gives you a sort of framework and general vocabulary to talk about the different forces at play here.
Yeah.
And what I think is sort of missing when it comes to, again, maybe to say it provocatively here, maybe it's not missing, but maybe it hasn't been passed down to me in this way, is just what statement captures the whole dynamic of building a God concept.
Right.
And the best that's been done is to, in my mind, is to say, well, look, it's a relationship with God. And this idea of a relationship with God, first of all, it kind of presupposes you have some idea of what God is, which is susceptible to change.
And first of all, that he is.
Sure.
I don't think we would say that you would have a relationship with, say, just an idea, right? So we would say that apart from me, there is something to have a relationship with. And then to get at that framework, well, then you'd have to talk about what's a relationship.
Sure. So it seems, maybe, this is actually something else that I wrote down, but I threw the envelope away.
Yeah,
it seems to me like there's two ways that we form a concept of God. One is philosophical definitions and arguments, and another is narrative, whether it's from the Bible or the narrative of our own life, let's say. We just we have this notion of who God is philosophically as what exactly?
Yeah.
But
yeah.
we have this idea of God as the biggest thing out there.
I think that's a good way of putting it, right? And then within that umbrella of philosophical, there's certain other ways, right? So philosophical being, God is one, God is this, God is this, God is this, and then under the narrative, you would have this sort of shared experience, human experience, which might be captured in the Bible, but then also, two
captured in the
subgroups,
life
right?
of the
Captured.
church.
Oh, you mean in the first one within the Bible?
I mean,
so like a shared human experience that's captured in the Bible, in the life of the church, but then also at the individual level, because each person has to contend with that.
Yeah, actually, Pope John Paul II in Fides et Ratio, his kind of opening argument in the first bit of the encyclical was that we can learn about who God is by observing how he's played out in the lives of historical people in the church. And we could, if you were to look at everyone in the church and see how their lives have played out and how the Spirit is working in the body of Christ, in the church, what is it, the church militant?
The church militant.
The people on earth. If you could look at how we've been integrating God into our different situations, that will give you a more general idea of who God is and how he is.
And I think I am understanding your original statement. I had it, now lost it. But I think I'm understanding what you mean. Like, does that relate to what you were saying about the certain lack of lived belief that we have nowadays that you mentioned earlier? That there's something missing or something.
Well, I guess where I'm coming from is there seems to me problems that could have been avoided before they happened.
Okay, so specifically speaking,
so
an example.
Let's say my three examples would be in the case of me myself, of this idea of God as sort of generous. I don't want to say loving, but overly kind, maybe. Well, I think I overemphasized his kindness, and then when kind of life hit, then that was too kind for my life. Like God was too kind in my own mind to allow these things to happen. So I had to reformulate my whole concept of God, and that was a hard thing to do. That, if I'm honest, I don't think I've fully come out the other side. Where now I have a hard time reconciling my life experiences with the tender side of God. Where there's sort of an imbalance in my own spirituality, where this idea of God is this sort of, I see the tough love side, and I have a hard time reconciling it with the tender love side. And I think that's the source of a lot of my own current spiritual problems, let's say. Okay. But there seems like there should be a sort of... It seems like there's obviously something missing, some puzzle pieces missing, which shouldn't have to be missing.
Okay.
Or so, it seems like...
Like what specifically?
Well, I don't know.
You just have this sort of general sense that that something is missing.
Yeah.
In terms of your personal conceptualization of God?
Yeah, or I've experienced it firsthand.
Okay.
Where I think
you have this experience.
Let's say the philosophical definitions of God is all-knowing, all-loving, all-just, all-merciful. All these things, they don't help me navigate my spiritual life. So there has to be more to our conception of God than just the philosophical definitions.
Right.
And then there's this holistic, personal image of God we get from Scripture. Right? But there's so much to integrate there, where it's a bunch of stories.
Yeah.
And it's almost like it's almost like the Bible's given us all the data points, and we have to extrapolate for ourselves what the core ideas are. And it's not clear it's not clear to me how someone becomes the kind of person who could navigate both ends of paradoxes. So like some people are just beat up by their own habitual sin. And so maybe they just need to hear the merciful side of the story about how merciful God is. Maybe that's what they need to hear. And then maybe there's some people who are just too lax, right? Where they're just falling into their habitual sin but not worried about it. And maybe they need to hear the justice side of things, right? But then me and you can kind of step back from all this and say, well, hey, how do you become the kind of person who can navigate both ends of the paradox?
Right.
It's like, I don't hear anyone talking about this in that way.
So, okay, two things come to mind. The first is with your own personal experience.
Sure.
I can't help but wonder, because if we're talking about God in relationship, that means that God is also presenting to us in a certain way, right? So when we first met, right, I kind of had to put on the nicer side of myself, right? I had to put my best foot forward, right, in order to attract you, to kind of, impress you guys, your family, right? When I first, came over with Emily, right? That was how I was presenting to you guys right off the bat, right? Putting my best foot forward. And I can't help but wonder if at that time in your life God was presenting himself in a certain fashion, right? As good, as kind. That was something that you took for granted. But that at one point in your life he did have to put on the tough love. He did have to kind of show you this other side of himself that maybe you didn't necessarily like. And I'm wondering if, your personal experience like that, also relates to those two examples that you were talking about. Well, at one point, I definitely need a swift kick in my ass, to get me
Sure.
to actually live life, right? So for me, it was my first girlfriend, breaking up with me.
Mm-hmm.
It's been funny for me because it's been women, who really, but I'm serious. They've really shown me where I lack. So for me, it was my first girlfriend. She broke up with me, and I was in this very severe state in life where after that I was partying, I was drinking, I was taking pills, and it took me that kind of misery, right? Because it wasn't fun. I realized I had awful relationships, but it was the recognition that I had terrible relationships that brought me back to God.
Mm-hmm.
So I needed that swift kick in the pants, right, from that breakup, which was awful, to get me to turn to God. The second time it happened, I was with my last girlfriend before Emily, and she cheated on me. It was right before I went to Franciscan to start discerning the priesthood. I had been going back and forth between breaking up with her for the longest time.
Mm-hmm.
And looking back, and even at that time, I recognized, God, So she cheated on me, and that day I broke up with her after debating for it for a few months, right? So, that sucked, and I do not wish that upon anybody. But for me, I needed that swift kick in my pants to kind of, okay, God is asking me to do something. He's revealing himself within the circumstances of my life in a certain way, right? So before my previous girlfriend, I had this idea of God, but it was this sort of amorphous, thing, right? And I had these sort of principles that I'd learned in catechism class and through my mom. But it didn't make sense. Once I encountered those awful experiences, I myself, God, I think, was trying to tell me something. And it was only those experiences that I think, he knew me at the time, right? He's always in relation to us. Whether that's distant relationship, whether that's close, whether that's conflicted. And that this goes back, I think, to the idea of that fluidity, right? That relationship. At that time, God had to kind of show me, life sucks, and there's a lot that you can do, though, to make yourself better, to make things better for you. And then, further on, after my girlfriend cheated on me, I went into the discernment program, and I was like, and, God was showing me, okay, I had to kick you in the butt like this, but now you have all these amazing friends, all these amazing men who are in your life now, who are calling you on. Okay, and so that was just a thought about your personal experience. Was that maybe at that time, when you thought God was a grandfather, was actually Him revealing Himself in that way to you, but then through the circumstances of your life, maybe He was trying to show you, but that's not all I am, right? And especially if we're thinking about God, our concept of God as a relationship, it's fluid. At times you're revealing yourself in certain ways to somebody, but at other times, there's a certain point at which you have to change or remind yourself that, okay, the person isn't always this way, right? So your expectations kind of set you up to hit, smack you in the face. Go ahead.
Yeah. So there's two things.
I had another thought about that, but you go ahead.
Okay.
It was on a different vein.
Sure.
Now I forgot it.
So it seems to me like there's two things that are going on here. One is, and maybe this helps us maybe articulate the problem a little more clearly, which is what's going on a priori, which puts us in a position where if something happens to us, we look to God and we try and interpret our situation in a way that brings us closer to God, or lets us see what God's trying to do in our life, right? So there has to be something a priori going into every situation, which is
my mind goes to the Bible, and if we're trying to talk about the stage, the principles, just as in ethics, just as in physics, right? That there has to be these sort of statements. Well, one, first of all, is that we as human beings, and this is, I think, captured in Genesis. If you listen to Jordan Peterson's lectures on it, they're quite wonderful. But that in Genesis, the author is laying this foundation that, first of all, we're created by God in His image and likeness. Those two statements, right, image and likeness, in and of themselves, are very deep and difficult concepts. But so that first is that we are individuals, and that we are agents, right, with value and worth. So for maybe that might be a statement or a principle that that orients us during those times when we are coming across this tension.
So let me
yeah.
do an example with that, and with that principle, and with that as the principle.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say I'm in a in a tight spot like you, where I'm in the face of rejection from schools or girls, or family life is just rough for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And then I'm in the middle of the moment, and then I say to myself, well, what was the way you articulated? It was, I'm a person of dignity and worth, and how do I see that in this situation? Or
yeah, but not just that, and I want to try to get past these sorts of phrases that we use so commonly, because if we actually believed or understood those concepts of dignity and worth, right, and had a fleshed out articulation and view of those things, that would be our guiding principle. That would always be the ground in which or the lens through which we see the experiences of our lives. So getting past even just that. So right. So if you're having this experience, hardship, right, or suffering, and you think, I'm a person with dignity and worth. Well, what the heck does dignity and worth mean, right? So if I just repeat it, I have dignity and worth. I have dignity and worth. Is that going to produce some sort of action in me? Because you can state that, right, that I believe I am a person of dignity or worth, and then go and shoot up with dope, or smoke some crack, right, or sleep around. So what exactly does that does even that statement mean? And maybe I just kind of clouded the waters a little bit.
I don't know. I'm gonna shut the window real quick.
Yeah.
I think that's.
Yeah, 1, 2, maybe. We need some soundproof walls.
Yeah, we need some kind of background light too next time around.
Yeah.
Growing pains.
Yeah, for sure.
No, I don't think that muddied the waters. I think there's situational wisdom for any situation. Like, I don't think people are in a new situation usually.
Mm-hmm.
I think most of the situations you find yourself in relationally or spiritually, I think these are thoughts and feelings and emotions that someone else has felt before you.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of situational wisdom out there. And then there's something more fundamental, which is, look, if you look at someone like me and you, it's like, I think we have the wisdom to try to be creative about how do we find the silver lining in any situation. Mm-hmm. And for someone like me and you, if we're going through a rough patch, I think we have the wherewithal to think to ourselves, like, what's God doing here?
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, how do we teach someone to get to that point?
Mm-hmm.
And then how do we teach people to recognize what's important and what's not? So, like, for example, one of the objections I hear from non-Christians is, like, I still hear the objection, you guys believe in some man in the sky. And God's location just isn't important in a sense.
Yeah.
Where it's like, no, if you don't see God, and if you go to the moon and you don't see, if you look around and don't see God, it's like, that's not important. So there's...
I like that famous quote from the astronaut.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was referring to.
Right.
But there's... How do we when we hear that, we just recognize that as like, look, God's location just isn't important. Mm-hmm. You know, I heard someone else who's not a Christian get really hung up about the fact that there weren't dinosaurs in Genesis. Yeah. Like when God was making all the animals, like they didn't mention dinosaurs.
Yeah.
It's like, I know that that's not important, right? Like, how did I get here? That's my question. 'Cause
how did you, like Stephen, get to where you are in your understanding of the Bible? In that specific
my understanding of God.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's like, that's just not important.
Yeah.
The age of the earth is not important, spiritually speaking. I don't think anyone really cares how old the earth is.
Yeah.
I think some people might get hung up about it for some reason.
Yeah. Well, it's because you were raised in a Catholic family. So of course you're going to be Catholic. And believe the Catholic Church and what it teaches.
Maybe that's a good point, because there's something true about that, but there's also...
That was me being a little tongue-in-cheek, though.
Well, yeah, but... Well, hang on, because there's still something about me that's flexible enough to navigate different situations with spiritual creativity. Mm-hmm. And how do we generate spiritually creative people? Maybe that's the
question.
Maybe that is, because...
So going back to maybe the beginning is how can has a rectification of conceptualizations resolve spiritual conflicts?
Right.
So
and
maybe it's more of a question of how do we
become the kind of people who can reformulate our conceptions of God in a way that actually...
that are flexible.
That results in progress. Mm-hmm. Because there's a way to interpret your whole situation. Where I know, like, most of the fallen away Catholics that I know, for example, they've fallen away because they just were forced to do something they didn't want to do. Mm-hmm. Which maybe go to church. What? They just go to church, in some cases every day, and they just didn't get anything out of it. Yeah, it was just boring to them. Yeah. And they also felt like their parents didn't give them any room to ask good questions. Mm-hmm. And so I forget what I was going for there. But but their thing is to reject the whole game.
Mm-hmm. Off the bat.
And they just never look back. Where they're like, I just want to get as far away from that life as I can, right? Because that life I had nothing but bad memories, right? Where there's another interpretation of it, which is like, look, my parents are kind of hung up, and this is not from experience, but these aren't my parents, but maybe my parents are hung up on the earth being 6,000 years old. Yeah, there's maybe another way to get out of my childhood thinking, well, look, that's just not important. Yeah. So, but I can still come away from that childhood with like this instinct to further my relationship with God. Yeah. This instinct to be spiritually creative. Mm-hmm. And you gotta I gotta. All right, maybe we could let this digest.
Table that for a little bit. Yeah, I think maybe putting it off for another. But yeah, I think it's an important thing to consider, and I think it's an extremely complex issue, because my mind, as you're speaking, my mind is going in like 20 different directions at once. On a personal level, it's a matter of your experiences, your personality. What was presented to you. Did you go through anything traumatic? How were your parents and their relationship with God? How did they live their lives as a child? All these different things might definitely who were your friends in high school might at one point be something critical for you. So for somebody, it might have been a traumatic experience with a priest, and they just got rid of Catholicism wholesale.
Yeah.
Now that's a generalization, right? Oh, because this one priest did did this bad thing to me, that means the whole religion is bad. I think we do that a lot of the times. In cognitive behavior therapy, that's what we call a generalization. You take one little fact and you blow it up to color your whole experience, right? So, man, I was on this date with this girl, and I said goodbye in the most awkward way, so the date was just terrible, right? Like, oh, she's never gonna call me again. So we make these sort of generalizations by focusing on one negative thing or experience, where and it might have been like a really great conversation before that, or you might have nailed it on the dinner and getting her flowers, but it was just that one thing that you focused on that colored your whole experience. So I think it's a complex issue in terms of creating or instilling in people a sort of dynamic, flexible understanding, an orientation to God.
But there has to be a solid dynamic at the foundation. Mm-hmm. And that's where I'm coming from with the physics analogies, where these physical principles are fully articulated. They're equations, they're set in stone, they're hard, but they're applicable to so many different situations. Like these underlying truths build the sort of, it lets us talk about the different forces at play.
Structure, order, a certain order.
Yeah, well, it lets us, I'm thinking about the dynamics where it's like it lets us, and if you're doing civil engineering, but it lets us talk about the different forces at play in any given situation. But we want to instill this idea of what a force is. And how to recognize different forces as such. In like spiritually. And it's like someone like me and you who've, I would say, let's say, have some degree of spiritual maturity, where we have the wherewithal to look at a new situation and say, what's God getting at? And say, where might this be going? And I have the spiritual creativity to ask these questions. And to recognize where I might have a problem, and to try and think about solutions to that. It's like the whole thing, that whole game. How do we get here?
My thought goes back to God attachment. I think that might be one way of looking at it, and explaining that sort of spiritual maturity. Is having a secure attachment with God. That might be something we can save for next time.
Sure. Do you want to put this on pause because you gotta?
Yeah, I gotta get going actually too.
You gotta get going?
But yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, until next time. I guess that's a podcast.
Yeah.
I was hoping to keep going, but.
Yeah. I wish I could too. But.
All right. Well, I'll listen to this, and hopefully we hit a bunch of cool concepts. I think we did.
Yeah.
Or I think we talked a lot about a lot of cool
fumbled
points.
our way through.
We did. I think we did fumble, but I think if we listen to this again, hopefully we kind of do the metacognition and realize what we were kind of getting at in hindsight, and hopefully the second conversation will help us talk with more clarity about maybe the questions and the problems and
I think we did well. I think we summarized a lot, and we came back to the original questions.
I think we did
a few times. So.
Oh yeah, I'm happy with these. I think this has kind of been the theme in my first few podcasts, where there's a little bit of fumbling, but I think we hit on a lot of great points.
Yeah.
And I think so going forward, it's really helping us to. We've already thought about these things, and so now we could talk about them better. So a little more comfortably.
Hopefully, you don't get too much of that, because that's.
The noise, and the lights.
Really,
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if you can really filter those out somehow.
Just gotta take the guy out, I think.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for coming.
Yep, Steven.
Till next time.
Yep.